The Soviet army in East Germany was like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. Our job was to go out and collect whatever information we could. We really did set forth unarmed, incommunicado, 3 days at a time into East Germany. One moment you could be at a cocktail party reception with the Soviets, and then the next day you could be arrested for getting too close to rocket launchers. I was involved in this big crash at a radar site in Assenstedt. Suddenly a large 10-ton truck came winging out and slammed slap bang into us. After the Cold War, there is access to the Stasi archives, and we can see that these were deliberately planned ambushes with an intention to kill. It's quite nice that we didn't know that at the time. My name is Peter Williams. I was in BRIXMIS, the British Commander-in-Chief's mission to the group of Soviet forces in Germany, based in Berlin in the 1980s for 4 years. At the end of the Second World War, it was decided that conquered Germany should be ruled or managed, as it were, by the 4 victorious allies: the United States, the Soviet Union, UK, and France, and by military commanders, not by civilians. And so 4 commanders-in-chief, each were given their own zone of occupation, and the British came up with a liaison agreement with the Soviet commander-in-chief to place missions in one another's zones of occupation. And the British one later became known as BRIXMIS for short. And its counterpart, the Soviet mission, was based in the Western Germany, in the British zone of occupation, and was known to us all as SOXMIS. And it was an outstation of the Soviet military intelligence network. The initial idea was that they should conduct sort of routine bureaucratic liaison communication between the headquarters. But from the very beginning, it was obvious that this would present an intelligence collection opportunity. By the 1980s, it had become a very slick professional intelligence collection organisation under the umbrella of this kosher diplomatic liaison organisation.
131 2764 PR 157.
The intelligence that we were focusing on was operational intelligence. So where are the Russians? Mostly the Russians, although there was a large East German military as well. Where are they? Where are they based? What are they doing? Our job was to go out and collect whatever information we could, technical information, and principally that meant taking photographs, because the photographs could then come back and be analysed later on. A lot of it was taking photographs of columns of vehicles on the road. Most of the wheeled equipment moved on roads when it was out of barracks. And we spent a lot of time watching railway lines for trains full of tanks and other equipment, either going out on exercise or being imported into East Germany.
486, 479, 480.
I think the Soviets quite liked the fact that we were interested in their equipment. They spent a lot of money creating all this stuff. There's no point having it if you don't show it off to an extent. But they didn't want to just give it to us on a plate. The Soviet army in East Germany was like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces were in effect secret. We sucked up any information we could photographically, and stealing it physically if it was left lying around, in order to build this jigsaw puzzle. Typical BRIXMIS tour, as we call these patrols, was a 3-man effort. Corporal driver, a tour NCO, who might be anything from a sergeant up to a warrant officer, and a tour officer, who would normally be a captain or a major, or in the case of the Air Force, a flight lieutenant or a squadron leader. The officer took the photographs. The driver was responsible for the security of the vehicle, so while we were doing nefarious things, it was his job to make sure we weren't about to be bounced by Soviet special forces or something. And the tour NCO was armed with a dictaphone tape recorder, and so while the officer took photographs, he shouted into the dictaphone what was going on.
08.
While he was shouting into the dictaphone, held in his left hand, with his right hand he would wave. And the principle behind this was it gave the impression that the British were incredibly friendly because they were always waving. But also It's a very cheap form of deception because it's impossible to see a man taking a photograph from the back of the vehicle because you're drawn to this sort of nodding dog waving hand in the corner of the screen. We'll also go and look for Soviet field latrines because there's a lot of good stuff to be found in an ad hoc loo somewhere because they didn't get issued with loo paper. Their ration pack didn't include loo paper, so they had to wipe their bums with something. And so it was normally, it could be the newspaper, which was good because that dates the dump in the woods. And letters from home were another favourite one that they would recycle and use as loo paper. And so we would collect all this stuff, it's not a very glamorous job, and then take it back to Berlin and dry it off and see what analysis could come out of some mother's letter from Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan or something like that to her little boy. It was like winning the national lottery because you never knew what you were going to find every time you crossed the Glienicke Bridge from West Berlin into Potsdam and further out into East Germany. It was I Spy paradise for soldiers. There was what I describe as a Jekyll and Hyde reality, the Jekyll being the sort of formal liaison, diplomatic liaison, so we would have regular meetings. So that was the sort of above board role that we had, that sort of formal liaison. But below that, there was the sort of Mr. Hyde, the sort of monster at work. And you could be at one moment, you could be in a cocktail party reception with the Soviets, and then the next day you could be being arrested for getting too close to rocket launchers or something. So it was, every day was dramatically different. There were two sorts of hazards. One was sort of accidental, rough of the play stuff with the Soviets. You get too close to things and you get chased, and sometimes you get crashed into and so forth, and occasionally you have to sort of put your hands up and stop before it gets too violent. But the other people who were trying to keep an eye on us were the Stasi, the East German secret police. And there were about 5,000 of them whose job it was to conduct surveillance against the military liaison missions and foreign diplomats. But they were very much part of the everyday picture. This is a typical Stasi vehicle with two young men in it. In East Germany, there was a 10-year waiting list to buy a car. And so generally speaking, young men didn't have cars. So normally two young men in a car is a bit of a giveaway. And when they get the cameras out and start taking photographs, it's game, set, match. Of course, what we were trying to do was discover what was normal in East Germany and what was abnormal. They were doing exactly the same. They were following us as much as anything else to see if we were doing what we normally did. And if we suddenly started doing something else, should they be alarmed by it? But the Stasi became more and more professional, I think, in their dealings with these outside organizations like us by the mid-70s, late 70s. And it's at about that time that, for reasons unknown to us, they suddenly decided that they would set in place plans to ambush passing military liaison vehicles.
Reculez, 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 vite, 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 reculez, reculez. Démerdez-vous, 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 reculez, reculez, bordel. Reculez, reculez à fond, tout droit, à fond. Encore. Voilà.
I was involved in this big crash at a radar site in Attributions in August 1982. The new Brigadier John Lermont, was going out on one of these patrol tours, and I was told, take him out, give him a good time. And so we set off from Potsdam. We were followed by the Stasi, very obviously. And then they seemed to disappear, which was quite reassuring. It was going to be a nice trip without too much excitement, or so we hoped. Then suddenly from afar we saw a radar site. I said, "This, don't worry about it. We'll let the RAF people deal with radar sites." We drove a bit further through the little village of Eisenstedt, and there was one of the signs, a mission restriction sign, saying no military missions to go past this sign. And he went, "There's one of those signs." And I said, "Well, sir, don't forget, we don't pay any attention to them because they're not in the 1946 agreement." And so we play this legal myth that they have no status. And we drove on a bit further, and as we got uphill, coming out instead, I saw that the radar site, which we'd seen from quite a distance, was suddenly much closer than I was expecting it to be. I assumed it would be well set back from the road. And so I asked the brigadier to put his camera away, and I asked the driver to put his foot on the floor. And I thought, if we can only get as far as the front gate and past it, we'll be okay. As we passed the beginning of the radar station, I saw in the side mirror, I saw a man jump out of the ditch and throw a barrier across the road behind us. And it was fairly clear that going back was not an option, and we had to keep going forward. We nearly got past the main gate when suddenly a large 10-ton truck came winging out from the front gate of this radar site and slammed slap bang into us onto the side of the vehicle, pushing us across the road. We were very lucky not to be rolled. Had we rolled in this Opel Senator car, I think we would certainly have been killed or badly wounded. But instead we were jammed against a fruit tree on the side of the road and this 10-ton truck. So that was a slightly dramatic moment I hadn't anticipated. We were all shaken, but we were checked ourselves out and we all seemed to be all right. So I said to Brigadier, what I think we should do, sir, is make it clear to them that we're going to get out of the car, we'll leave the driver in the car, and we will complain that this really wasn't very fair. So in my best German, which isn't very much, I said, my general is not amused, and they began to realise that maybe this wasn't just any old group of passing Brits. Eventually a Soviet officer did turn up and took control of the situation. But by this stage the Stasi had arrived and were taking lots and lots of photographs. And I said to the brigadier, what we should do is what Brits do at times like this. We'll have a brew, we'll have a cuppa. And they got more and more persistent in their photography, very dull. And eventually one of them almost sort of got up to me, and so I went oof with my cup of coffee and threw it over him. It was a very satisfying moment. The coffee settled on him, but as it settled on him, I thought, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And I turned to the brigadier and I said, I'm so sorry, sir, he's such an odious little person. He had it coming to him. My personal Stasi file does describe me as a hooligan for throwing coffee over their agents. We didn't realise the Stasi actually were planning to try and kill us that day, or we might not have gone past that radar site, but you have to be lucky, and we were lucky. Whereas 2 years later, the French had a very similar incident, and the driver was killed, the officer was badly injured and had to be taken to an East German hospital.
2 numbers, wrong, 3 numbers, 4, 3.
We had, in every sense, unique access to Soviet soldiers in a sort of semi-social setting, on manoeuvres. They weren't 10 feet tall, they were fairly normal people. And of course they had all sorts of internal problems in their military because they had so many different nationalities and levels of Russian speaking, if nothing else, amongst their soldiers. Are there lessons to be learned today? Yes, liaison was a wonderfully elastic term. Next time round, don't pin yourself down by defining what it means, just exploit the looseness of it all. But it was a very different world. So it was a world without the mobile phone, without GPS. We really did set forth unarmed, incommunicado, for sort of 3 days at a time into East Germany. It's impossible to imagine in our modern risk-averse world sending men off into hostile territory, unarmed and with no communications now. But it worked for us. It was extremely valuable. Nobody else had this sort of access that the 3 Western military missions had in East Germany. We were able to report at a sort of human level on the reality out on the ground. We were sort of not being affected by propaganda or confirmation bias. We were doing our own thing, coming back and reporting as honestly as we could and as accurately as we could on what we saw out on the ground. And so while people might have occasionally had sort of panics at the diplomatic level that things were tumbling out of control, we were there, we were available to be used as a sort of source of verification. I left Berlin in April 1989, so 7 months or so before the wall came down. And we had no idea that this was going to happen. Such an exciting job, why would you want it to end? and so we assumed we'd be back in another 3 or 4 years. All the Western missions and the 3 Soviet missions in each of the former zones in West Germany all stood down. They stopped operating on the 2nd of October 1990, which is the eve of reunification on the 3rd of October. So they came to an end. I was on exercise in Nanyuki in Kenya when I heard the news about it. I had a piece of wire into a Wrigley tin roof, and I was listening to the World Service, and I thought, this cannot be right. You know, this has got to be one of those like famous things, Orson Welles thinking that the Martians had landed, and surely this can't be true, but it was. But it was a surprise to everybody. For a lot of people, it was the most exciting or the only exciting thing they got to do. You know, I was lucky enough to do a number of other weird things along the way, but it was very much a highlight of one's life to have done it.